If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. The evening air pressed against my skin, warm but unsettled, like the hush before a storm. The city around me had slowed to a quiet murmur, streetlights flickering in their steady rhythm, the distant hum of tires against wet pavement. I wasn't in a hurry, I should have been, but something about the night felt different. The kind of different you don't notice right away, the way a song sounds a little off key, or the way your own reflection seems to hold a thought you haven't had yet. That was when I saw him, a man, standing too still beneath the glow of a buzzing street lamp. He wasn't looking at me. Not yet. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, chin tucked slightly downward, as if he were waiting. Waiting for something inevitable, for me. I had never seen him before, but when he finally lifted his head, his eyes met mine with something I can only describe as recognition. And then he smiled, not the kind of smile you offer a stranger, the kind of smile you give someone you've known, someone whose life you understand in ways they never could. I slowed my steps. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored him completely, but my body hesitated, betraying some deeper instinct I didn't understand. He took one step forward, then another, and by the time I realized I was standing still, we were close enough for me to see the lines in his face, creases of deep thought, as if his entire existence had been spent in consideration. When he spoke, his voice was calm, unshaken. "You've had that dream again." I blinked. I should have said something. Anything, because he was right. The dream. My dream. The one I had never told a single person. A slow chill curled through me, like unseen fingers brushing against my spine. The man studied my face, as if he were waiting for my mind to catch up. And then, before I could force out a single word, he leaned in and whispered how I was going to die. A quiet settled between us, deeper than the night, heavier than my own breath, and then he turned. And he walked away, just like that, as if he had done what he came to do, as if this had all played out before. I stood there, my pulse beating against my ribs, my thoughts unraveling into something tangled and raw. Because I knew, deep down, in some part of me I couldn't reach, he might be right. I stood frozen beneath the glow of the streetlight, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. The man had vanished into the shadows, his words lingering like a scent in the air. He had told me how I would die. And worse, I believed him. The night pressed in around me, damp and electric, like the space between a heartbeat and the next. A streetcar rattled in the distance, its metal wheels screeching faintly against the tracks. Somewhere nearby, a neon sign buzzed and flickered, its hum vibrating against the silence. I swallowed, forcing myself to move, one step, then another. I tried to convince myself that it didn't mean anything, that he was just some lunatic, a man with a strange fixation, a twisted sense of humor. But doubt gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, burrowing in like a parasite, because he had known about the dream. For weeks I had woken up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the images from my subconscious slipping away like water through my fingers. But the feeling remained, the dread, the certainty that something was coming. Now, the pieces were falling into place. I turned a corner, my pace quickening as I stepped onto the quieter end of the street. The old bookstore was still open, its window display a collage of antique novels and forgotten stories. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, offering a momentary illusion of safety. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the air smelled of paper and time. The old man behind the counter barely glanced up, his thick glasses reflecting the amber glow of the desk lamp. I wandered the aisles, fingers trailing along the spines of books I didn't bother reading. My mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of that encounter, replaying the man's voice over and over. Was he telling the truth, And if he was, how much time did I have? My pulse quickened. The shelves around me felt taller, the space between them narrower. I could feel something watching, an invisible presence pressing in. I turned sharply. Nothing. Just rows of books, their faded covers standing silent. I exhaled, trying to shake the unease from my skin. But then, the old man behind the counter cleared his throat. I turned to him, expecting some casual remark, some idle conversation to ground me. But instead, he just stared. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke. "You met him, didn't you?" A stillness filled the room, thick and absolute. I couldn't answer. I didn't have to. The way his expression darkened the way his fingers curled slightly against the wooden counter. He already knew. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken things. Then, finally, his gaze flickered downward. And he did something that made my stomach tighten. He reached under the counter. There was the faint sound of a drawer sliding open, the rustle of old paper, the creak of something shifting. Then, with careful hands, he placed something onto the counter between us. A photograph. I stepped forward, hesitant, my fingers tingling as I reached for it. The image was old, black and white, edges curled, faded with time. It showed a street I didn't recognize, a row of buildings that looked both familiar and wrong. And in the center of it, the man, standing exactly as I had seen him, hands in his coat pockets, that unreadable expression etched into his face. Only, this photo wasn't recent. It wasn't from tonight. It wasn't even from this decade. I stared at the picture, my breath catching in my throat. The old man shifted, watching me carefully. And then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, he whispered, "He's been here before." A shiver traced its way down my spine. I tore my eyes from the photograph, but when I looked back at the old man, his expression had changed. His eyes had gone distant, like he was remembering something he had spent a long time trying to forget. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, just as I opened my mouth to ask the question burning in my mind, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and in the split second between darkness and light, I saw movement. A shadow shifting in the reflection of the bookstore's front window. Someone standing just outside, watching. The air inside the bookstore had changed. It was heavier now, thick with something unseen but deeply felt. The dim glow of the desk lamp flickered against the dark corners of the shop, casting restless shadows that seemed to move even when nothing else did. The old man behind the counter was still watching me, his gaze unreadable. The photograph lay between us, its edges curled, its surface worn with time. The man in the picture, he was the same one I had met tonight. I turned my head, drawn to the glass storefront where I had seen movement. The reflection trembled with the soft flicker of the overhead lights, but there was no one there. No figure standing just beyond the glass. No watching presence, and yet I knew someone had been there. A slow exhale left my lips, my pulse still uneven. When I turned back to the old man, I expected him to say something, to explain, to offer reassurance or maybe a warning. But instead, he simply pressed his lips into a thin line, his fingers tightening around the wooden counter. I took the photograph. The texture of it was strange, almost too smooth for something so aged. I traced my thumb along the man's face, as if the answer might be embedded in the ink itself. "Who is he?" I finally asked, my voice lower than I intended. The old man hesitated, not like he didn't know, but like he wasn't sure how much to say. "He's always been here," he murmured at last. The words didn't sit right. What does that mean? The old man's gaze flickered to the window. Outside, the streets were quiet, the air still. A car rumbled past in the distance, headlights cutting through the darkness. Then, without looking at me, he said, "I remember him from when I was a boy." A chill crawled up my arms. That photo, it was decades old, and yet the man in it looked exactly the same. I stared at the picture again, my mind struggling against the logic of it. The old man sighed, his voice lowering. "He doesn't age, he doesn't change, but he always knows things." His fingers tapped once, lightly, against the counter. Things no one should know. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. How many people has he spoken to? The old man shook his head. I don't know, but whenever he appears something follows. My grip on the photograph tightened. Something. The air in the room seemed colder now. The overhead light flickered again, buzzing softly before steadying. The old man leaned in slightly, his expression grave. You don't get to unmeet him. A ringing sound echoed in my ears. I suddenly felt the weight of it the moment I had met that man on the street. My life had shifted. Like a door had been opened behind me, and I hadn't even heard it creak. I slid the photograph back toward the old man. I need to know more. His lips pressed into a thin line. There isn't much more to know. I shook my head. That's not true. His gaze met mine, and something in his expression darkened. I mean, he exhaled slowly, there isn't much more to know that you'll want to hear. Outside, the wind picked up. A rustling sound swept down the empty street, whispering through unseen corners. I tried to ignore the prickle at the back of my neck, the slow realization that something had shifted again. I checked the time, though I wasn't sure why. It was later than I thought. Hadn't I just gotten here? Had I really spent that long inside? The old man was still watching me, his hands resting on the counter, his expression unreadable. You should go home, he said at last. Try to forget you met him. But we both knew that wasn't possible. The door to the shop felt heavier when I pushed it open. The bell jingled, its sound somehow thinner than before. The street outside was quieter now, too quiet, the kind of silence that shouldn't exist in a city at night. I stepped onto the sidewalk, my breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The street lights buzzed, casting their glow onto pavement that suddenly looked too smooth, like the rain had washed away something I should remember. I started walking, not toward home, not toward anywhere in particular, just away, but as I walked, something nagged at me. The feeling that I was being led. The turns I made, the streets I chose, none of them felt entirely like my decisions. The night had a strange pull, and then, as I turned another corner, I saw him, standing beneath a flickering streetlight, hands in his coat pockets, the same unreadable expression on his face, waiting, the moment stretched, thin and sharp. He tilted his head slightly, and then he smiled, a slow, deliberate thing, and in that moment I knew. I hadn't been walking away from him. I had been walking toward him all along. The street around us felt empty. Not just quiet, not just still. Empty, like a space between moments where the rest of the world had yet to catch up. The man stood beneath the streetlight, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching me with the kind of patience that made my skin crawl. He had been waiting for me. I didn't move, neither did he. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbroken, pressing against my ears like the weight of the deep ocean. The street lamp above him flickered, its glow pulsing slightly, as if unsure whether to fully illuminate him or leave him hidden in shadow. I felt the photograph still clutched in my fingers, the one from the bookstore. The old, time-worn image of this man, unchanged for decades. A cold breeze rolled through the street. It should have carried the usual city sounds, cars in the distance, voices, the hum of life, but there was nothing. Just the low electric buzz of the flickering light above him. Then he moved, not toward me, not away. Just a shift in posture, a slow tilting of his head as he regarded me with faint amusement. Like he knew what I was thinking. Like he had already heard my thoughts before I had. I swallowed, my throat dry. What do you want? I finally asked. The man's smile didn't waver. He took a single step forward, the heel of his shoe clicking against the pavement. I only wanted to see if you'd come, he said. His voice was smooth, quiet, like the rustling of pages in an old book. Something in my stomach twisted. How did you know I would? He exhaled softly, as if the question amused him. Because, whether you realize it or not, you've already started listening. A faint prickle crept along my arms. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see anyone, but there was no one. Just a stretch of empty sidewalk and shuttered buildings, their windows dark. I turned back. He was closer now, not dangerously close, not within reach, but closer than before. I hadn't seen him move. His eyes, deep and unreadable, studied me like a puzzle he had already solved. "I know you have questions," he said. The cold night air pressed against me, but it wasn't just the temperature that made me shiver. "Who are you?" The man smiled wider. "Someone who remembers." My grip on the photograph tightened. "Remembers what?" His eyes flickered downward, to my hands. "You already know." The photograph felt heavier now, like it held more than just an image. I wanted to let go of it, drop it right there on the pavement, but something told me that wouldn't make a difference. I took a step back. He didn't follow. Instead, he tilted his head, like he was measuring how far I would go before I stopped running. A strange sensation coiled in my chest, like I had been here before, like this moment had already happened, and I was only catching up to it now. He watched me for a long moment, then spoke again. "Soon you'll understand." His voice carried something beneath the words, something almost gentle. That was the part that scared me the most. Not a warning, not a threat, just certainty. Like he wasn't predicting something. Like he was remembering it. I turned and walked away, not fast, not slow, but the feeling never left me. That I wasn't leaving him behind. I was walking towards something else. The night air clung to my skin, cold and damp, as I walked away from the man who claimed to remember everyone's future. Each footstep echoed against the pavement, swallowed by the eerie silence of the empty city street. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but I felt him. Not in the way you feel someone's eyes on your back, but in a way that was deeper, more unsettling, like an old memory trying to surface. A déjà vu that hadn't finished unraveling. I turned the nearest corner, hoping that the simple act of changing direction would shake off the weight of his presence. The city was different tonight. The buildings, the streetlights, even the air itself. It all felt just slightly wrong. Like I had stepped into a version of my own world that wasn't quite finished being built. The bookstore was up ahead. I hadn't meant to walk toward it, but my feet had taken me there anyway. The sign in the window still flickered with that soft, warm glow, casting just enough light onto the sidewalk to make the darkness around it feel even deeper. I hesitated before reaching for the door. It was open. That wasn't right. When I had left earlier, the owner had locked up. I had heard the bolt slide into place, had seen him turn off the lights, but now the door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of dim interior light spilling onto the sidewalk. A faint creak echoed as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old pages and something else, something faintly metallic, like the lingering trace of a storm. The shelves stretched high, towering and endless, their shadows reaching out like fingers. I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a quiet click. I wasn't alone. I knew it before I saw him. There, at the end of the narrow aisle, standing between rows of books older than either of us, was the man. He hadn't followed me. He had simply gotten here first. His hands were still in his coat pockets, his posture as calm and patient as ever. "I told you," he said softly. "You're already listening." The words settled into the quiet space between us, thick and unmoving. I swallowed. "Why are you here?" His eyes flickered, dark and knowing. "Because you are." A chill crawled along my spine. I wanted to step back, to put more space between us, but something told me it wouldn't matter. I glanced down at my hands. The photograph, the one I had taken from the bookshop earlier, was still there. But the moment I looked at it, my breath caught in my throat. It had changed. Before, it had been a grainy black and white image of the man, standing exactly as he had been earlier tonight. Now there were two figures, him and me, standing together in this very bookstore. I dropped it. The photograph fluttered to the floor, landing face up between us. The man didn't move. "Time doesn't work the way you think it does," he said. "It loops, folds, repeats." His gaze didn't waver. That's why I remember. A faint ringing filled my ears, the edges of the room seeming to blur. That's not possible. His expression didn't change. And yet, here we are. A book slipped from the nearest shelf, landing with a dull thud beside the fallen photograph. I didn't pick it up. The man exhaled, a slow, patient sound. You're starting to see it now, he murmured. The light in the bookstore flickered. Outside, beyond the window, the city seemed darker than before. The clock on the far wall didn't tick. I had the sudden, terrible feeling that I wasn't in the same version of the city I had walked into. I looked at the man. He was watching me, waiting for me to understand, and somewhere deep in my bones I already did. The silence inside the bookstore was heavy, pressing down on me like the weight of a dream I couldn't wake from. The man still stood at the end of the aisle, unmoving, his eyes watching me with that same unreadable expression. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but something about it had changed. The usual distant sounds, cars, voices, the occasional siren, were gone. Instead, there was only the wind, whispering against the glass like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I didn't want to be here anymore. I took a slow step backward, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The man didn't stop me. He didn't move at all. But as I turned, my fingers brushing against the doorknob, I realized something that made my breath catch in my throat. The door wouldn't open, not locked, not stuck, just not there anymore. I turned back sharply, my pulse hammering in my ears. The man tilted his head slightly. You're not trapped, he said, voice as calm as ever. Not yet. I swallowed hard, my fingers clenching into fists at my sides. What do you mean, not yet? Instead of answering, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and worn. He tossed it toward me. Instinctively, I caught it. It was a ticket, a train ticket. The edges were frayed, the ink faded. But when I looked closer, I saw that the date was for today, the time now. A deep, distant rumble filled the air. I turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the city had shifted. The streets outside were no longer empty. Dark figures moved through the mist, their shapes blurred and indistinct, like they weren't entirely real. Streetlights flickered above them, casting long, wavering shadows. And in the distance, cutting through the night like a blade of light, I saw something I knew shouldn't be there. A train station, but not the kind you'd find in this part of the city. The structure looked old, its iron framework stretching high into the darkness, its lamps glowing with a strange, flickering light. The man's voice was closer now. You need to get on. I turned back sharply. He was standing right beside me. I hadn't heard him move, his eyes deep, dark, and endless locked onto mine. This is the part where you decide, he said. The walls of the bookstore shuddered. I took an unsteady breath. My hand tightened around the ticket. Outside, the train station flickered, like a mirage on the edge of reality. The sound of an approaching train cut through the night. I didn't have much time. I looked at the man one last time. His expression hadn't changed. He already knew what I was going to do. I stepped toward the door, and this time it opened. The air outside was thick with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the mist clinging to the pavement or the distant hum of the city fading into the background. It was the weight of something unseen, pressing against my skin like the air itself was waiting. The train station shouldn't have been there. I knew this part of the city. I had walked these streets 100 times before, and there had never been a station here. But now, under the flickering glow of old iron streetlights, it stood as if it had always existed. The arching metal framework loomed above, its rusted beams twisting into the sky like grasping fingers. The name of the station was carved into the stone above the entrance, but the letters had worn away, leaving only faint, unreadable impressions. Somewhere deep within, a train whistle blew. The ticket in my hand was warm, not like paper should feel. This was different. Alive, I stepped forward. The street beneath my feet felt less solid now, as if reality was unraveling the closer I got to the station. The people moving around me dark silhouette, wets in the mist, walked with slow, deliberate steps, their faces hidden by the haze. They were heading toward the station too. Not a single one of them looked at me. A shadow moved beside me. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The man who had given me the ticket was gone. The station entrance yawned before me, an open mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The glow of the lamps inside was dim, casting long, trembling shadows along the tiled floor. I hesitated at the threshold. A sign hung just inside the station, its frame rusted and bent. The words were barely visible under years of grime. Boarding passes only, no return. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. Behind me, the city seemed impossibly far away now. The streets had stretched, distorting in a way that made my head spin. I could still hear the faint sounds of traffic somewhere in the distance, but it was muffled, distant, like a memory more than reality. Another train whistle. Closer this time, I stepped inside. The tiled floor was cold beneath my feet. A faint, rhythmic drip echoed from somewhere unseen, like water slipping through cracks in an ancient foundation. The mist coiled at my ankles, refusing to dissipate. There were more people inside, waiting. Some sat on old wooden benches, heads bowed, their faces obscured in shadow. Others stood near the edge of the platform, staring into the dark tunnel beyond, their bodies unnaturally still. The station stretched further than it should have. The ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, and the platform seemed to extend far beyond what my eyes could track. I moved toward the edge, my footsteps swallowed by the silence. A faint vibration shuddered through the floor. The train was coming. Something inside me whispered that this was my last chance to turn back. I clenched the ticket in my hand, the edges digging into my palm. Then, from behind me, a voice. Soft, familiar, too familiar. You shouldn't be here. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing among the waiting passengers was someone I knew. Someone who couldn't be here. They had been gone for a long time. Dead, the train's headlights pierced through the tunnel ahead, casting everything in stark white light. I took a step back, and the figure smiled. The sound of the approaching train filled the station, a deep, thrumming vibration that rattled my ribs and echoed through the vast, shadowed space. The figure standing before me, someone I had lost long ago, remained impossibly still, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. The edges of their face blurred, as if they weren't entirely there, shifting in and out of focus like something glimpsed through water. The train's headlights grew brighter, casting long, twisting shadows across the platform. The people around me, those silent, waiting figures, showed no reaction. They stood motionless, as if carved from stone, their backs straight, their heads bowed slightly forward. No breath, no movement, only the weight of their presence pressing against the air. I took a step back, my fingers tightening around the ticket in my hand. The warmth had returned, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The figure in front of me smiled, not a kind smile. Not a cruel one, just knowing. You don't remember, do you? Their voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the thick silence like a blade. The train surged closer. The tunnel leading into the station seemed endless, a void carved from something deeper than darkness. The light of the approaching engine barely touched its edges. My pulse pounded in my ears. I started, but my throat felt tight, dry, as if the words themselves didn't want to form. They took a step toward me. I took another step back. My heel met the edge of the platform. Below, the tracks stretched into nothingness. Not metal, not stone, not earth, just empty. The train emerged from the tunnel, an enormous shape of iron and shadow, its windows dark and opaque. The air around it felt wrong, thicker, heavier, charged with something unseen. A gust of wind surged past as it slowed, but the chill that followed wasn't from the motion. It carried whispers, low and urgent, slipping between the rusted beams of the station like fingers reaching from the void. I turned back toward the figure, but they were gone. In their place stood someone else. A man tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked faded, its edges frayed like something worn for too many years. His face was sharp but strangely indistinct, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He lifted his hand, gestured toward the train. The doors slid open. The passengers waiting on the platform, those silent figures, began to move. Not all at once, slowly, deliberately, their heads lifting as if responding to an unseen command. One by one, they stepped forward. Boarding, the man in the suit turned his gaze to me. Something flickered behind his eyes, something deep and hollow, something that felt like recognition. "This is your stop," he said. A shiver traced its way down my spine. My voice cracked. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here." He tilted his head slightly, the motion eerily slow, calculating. "Yet here you are." The train let out a long, low hiss. Inside, the darkness beyond the open doors seemed to pulse, shifting in a way that made my stomach turn. There were no visible seats, no flickering lights or distant passengers, just a yawning void where the interior should have been. The wind picked up again. A single piece of paper lifted from the ground, spiraling upward before drifting toward the tracks. The doors remained open, waiting. The man did not move. The other passengers had all boarded now, swallowed by the shadows within the train, leaving only their absence behind. I could hear my own breath, sharp and shallow. The station around me stretched, the walls curving outward, the ceiling arching impossibly high, as if the space itself was shifting. The man extended his hand. "Time to go," he murmured. A cold pressure settled in my chest, something deep and ancient pressing against my ribs like a weight I had carried forever without knowing it. I took a step forward. The warmth of the ticket pulsed in my palm. Another step. I was at the threshold now. The air beyond the doors was different, thick, silent, waiting. I hesitated. The train exhaled another breath of steam, and the platform beneath my feet trembled. The man's eyes met mine. "You've been here before." My body froze. The doors began to close. I had to decide. The sky had darkened to a deep, bruised purple, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I walked the empty streets, my footsteps softened by the thick, damp fog that curled around my ankles. The buildings on either side of me seemed taller than I remembered, their facades weathered, their windows dark. It was as if the town itself had exhaled a long, forgotten breath, stretching out into something unfamiliar. A street lamp flickered ahead, casting a pale, sickly glow onto the sidewalk. The moment my shadow stretched toward it, the bulb went out with a soft pop, plunging the corner into darkness. The only sound was the slow rhythm of my breathing, shallow and careful. I wasn't alone. Somewhere just beyond the veil of mist, something shifted. The scrape of movement against pavement, the faintest sigh of displaced air. Not footsteps exactly, something more deliberate, like a presence moving without needing to touch the ground. I turned a corner, my pace steady, controlled. The buildings were unfamiliar now, their walls lined with ivy that pulsed as though it were breathing. The street signs had no names. The windows, even those with curtains drawn, felt like eyes watching, their silence expectant. The rain had not yet fallen, but I could feel it in the air, thick and electric. It would come soon, and with it, I knew, so would they. A door creaked open to my left, just a sliver. The darkness beyond its threshold was absolute, as though the inside of the building had been swallowed whole. I kept walking. The alley ahead narrowed, its walls pressing in, bricks damp with something that wasn't quite water. The street lamp at the end of the alley buzzed faintly, its glow too dim to reach me. Then a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper. "You remember, don't you?" I stopped. The air was too still. The fog thickened, curling inwards, like fingers reaching for my skin. I turned slowly. A figure stood at the entrance of the alley, just out of reach of the fading light. Their form was indistinct, shifting slightly, like something glimpsed through a veil of water. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching, waiting. A droplet of rain struck my cheek, cold and deliberate. Another landed on my shoulder. Then another, the first warning, the town was about to wake up. I stepped backward, deeper into the alley. The bricks seemed to tremble at my touch, as though something inside them had stirred. The figure at the entrance did not move. Then they smiled, not a normal smile, not a human one. A slow curve, too wide, too knowing. The rain began to fall in earnest now, tapping against the pavement in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The street lamp buzzed once, then went out. The alley plunged into darkness, and in that darkness I heard them move. The rain came in sheets now, cold and relentless, soaking through my clothes in seconds. The sound of it filled the alley, a steady, drumming rhythm against the pavement. But beneath that noise, beneath the endless whisper of falling water, there was something else. Footsteps. Not quite right. They didn't splash. They didn't echo. They moved smoothly, without hesitation, as though the rain had no right to touch them. I pressed myself against the damp brick wall, my breath coming shallow and slow. The alley was too dark now. The street lamp had failed. The only illumination came in flashes lightning, distant but growing closer, illuminating the figure at the alley's mouth in jagged, flickering snapshots. The first flash, they stood perfectly still, their head tilted, as if listening. The second, their body had shifted not forward, not back, but subtly different, as though they were mid-motion in a way that didn't quite belong. The third, they were closer, too close. I took a step backward, my foot finding the slick edge of a puddle. The water rippled outward in concentric rings, vanishing into the dark. The rain was falling harder now, but the figure didn't move as expected. Instead of stepping forward, they simply were closer, just inches away. Lightning flashed again, and I saw them. The same knowing smile, the same shifting form, but their eyes. There was something wrong with them. Not empty, not glowing, but deep, endless, the kind of eyes that shouldn't be able to see the future, but did. "You remember now," they murmured, their voice threading through the rain like a whisper through fog. I tried to move, but my body felt rooted in place. The bricks behind me were no longer solid. They pulsed, like something alive, like something waiting to swallow me whole. I shook my head. "I don't know you." The figure didn't blink, not yet. Another flash of lightning, and in that single, blinding moment, I saw something more. This town was shifting. The streets beyond the alley wavered, buildings fading in and out of existence. Lamplights flickered like dying stars, and through the rain, figures moved, shadows of people, their faces blurred, their voices just a hum beneath the storm. This wasn't just a town, it was a memory, and I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat as I pressed forward, deeper into the alley, my hands scraping against the damp walls for balance. The bricks pulsed beneath my fingers, warm and wrong. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it thickened, like a curtain being drawn, obscuring the world behind me. And then silence. The rain stopped, not gradually, not as a drizzle fading to nothing. One moment, it was deafening. The next, the world was still. I turned back. The figure was gone. The town was gone. I stood in an empty field, the grass wet beneath my feet, the scent of rain lingering in the air. But something was wrong. Because the town hadn't disappeared, I had. The silence pressed in, thick and unnatural. My breath came unsteady, the dampness of the vanished storm still clinging to my skin. The world had changed in an instant. Gone was the town, the shifting buildings, the rain-soaked streets. In its place, an open field stretched endlessly beneath a sky that looked wrong. The grass beneath my feet was wet, but not from the rain. It felt slick, almost too soft, as if it had absorbed something else entirely. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something sweeter beneath it, something that didn't belong. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. There were no roads, no houses, no landmarks to tell me where I had been or where I was now. Just the endless stretch of the field, and, in the far distance, a figure standing perfectly still. They weren't the same as before. The man who had whispered my future was gone. This figure was taller, thinner, unmoving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been here long before I noticed it. I took a step forward, the wet grass pressing against my ankles. The air felt too still, like a held breath, waiting. Then the wind picked up, sudden and sharp, bending the grass around me in waves. The sky darkened, and the scent in the air changed. Not rain, not the storm that had swallowed the town before spitting me out here. This was something older. The figure in the distance didn't move, but I knew that it was watching. I wanted to call out, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A winding trail of deep impressions stretched from where I stood, leading not from the figure, but toward it. I hadn't been walking through an empty field. I had been following something. I knelt, pressing my fingers to the nearest footprint. The indentation was sharp, clear, fresh, but the grass around it was untouched. No bending, no broken blades. Like whatever had made them hadn't stepped here. It had simply appeared. A slow, sinking realization took hold. I wasn't following something. I was catching up to it, and I was almost there. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving an absence of sound that was somehow heavier than noise. My heartbeat filled the silence, slow and thunderous, like footsteps in the void. I kept my gaze on the figure in the distance, but I didn't move. Not yet. The footprints leading toward it were too perfect, too deliberate, as if they had been placed there for me to follow. The sky overhead had shifted again. It was no longer just dark. It was textured, rippling like water disturbed from beneath. Something was moving in it, not clouds, not birds, something else. I forced myself to look away, back to the ground, grounding myself in what was tangible. I crouched lower, pressing my palm to the wet earth. The sensation was immediate. An unsettling warmth, like the soil beneath wasn't just damp but alive. A whisper brushed against my ear, not words, not a voice, just the shape of sound, the impression of something being said just beyond the range of understanding. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone beside me. No one. The field stretched empty around me. The footprints still led forward. The figure in the distance remained unchanged, but I knew now. It wasn't standing still. It was waiting. I rose slowly, my breath steadying, and took another step forward. The moment my foot touched the next footprint, a sensation rippled through me. A pull, a weightless shift in reality, like I had stepped through an unseen threshold. The grass around me moved. No wind, no force, it simply reacted. Something unseen had passed through it. I swallowed, resisting the urge to look up at the sky again. Whatever was above me, I wasn't ready to see it. Another step, another pull. The figure was closer now. Not by much, but enough that I could begin to make out details. Its limbs were too long, its outline blurred at the edges, like it wasn't entirely tethered to this place. I hesitated, a whisper again, this time closer. I whipped around, expecting something behind me, but there was only the field, the dark horizon stretching into nothingness. Then I saw it, another set of footprints, not in front of me, behind, leading to where I had been standing moments before. A perfect mirror of my path. The realization settled in my bones like ice. I wasn't alone in the field. I never had been. I didn't move. The two sets of footprints, mine and the ones behind me, felt heavier than the earth itself, like they were anchoring me in place. The realization sat deep in my chest, a cold weight pressing against my ribs. The field was still, the air thick with something unseen, something I could feel but not name. I was being followed, not just now, not just here. It had always been there. A breath, was it mine, shivered in the empty space between my shoulders. I turned slowly, heart pounding in a rhythm too deliberate, too measured, like it wasn't my own. But there was nothing behind me. Just the footprints, my footprints, but they weren't mine, were they? They weren't pressed deep into the earth the way mine were. They weren't smudged with hesitation or shifted slightly off, center as I had walked. No, they had been placed there. Deliberate, precise, like something had been walking just behind me the entire time, mimicking my every step. I inhaled, steadying myself. The night had stretched longer than it should have, the darkness thick and unmoving. The air didn't taste right anymore. It was too still, too expectant. The figure ahead remained, its shape flickering at the edges, like watching something underwater. But it was closer now, much closer, and then, without sound, it moved, not toward me, not away, just shifted. Like a mistake in reality, a frame skipped in time. One moment it was there, and the next, it was slightly to the left. Its position impossible, unnatural. My stomach turned at the sight, my mind struggling to understand. The whisper came again, closer. This time, I understood something. Not words, not a voice, but intention, an invitation. The footprints behind me deepened, as if something unseen had just pressed its weight into them. A choice: step forward toward the figure, or turn around toward the thing that had always been there. The grass around me swayed again, not from wind, from movement, the unseen pressing itself against reality, making itself known. I swallowed hard. Somewhere in the dark sky above, something shifted, a presence, a void, waiting for me to decide. I took a breath, clenched my fists, and made my choice. I stepped forward. The moment my foot touched the earth, something in the air changed. The static weight pressing down on the world lifted slightly, like a held breath being released. The figure ahead of me remained still, watching, if it even had eyes. Its form was undefined, something shifting between a silhouette and a hollow absence of space itself. The footprints behind me, mine but not mine, remained where they were. I didn't dare turn back to look at them. I knew now that whatever was pressing into them was still there, waiting, watching, expecting something. A test. I took another step, and the earth beneath my feet softened unnaturally, as if I was stepping onto something that wasn't quite solid ground anymore. The air smelled thick, damp, and old, like pages of a forgotten book left to rot in the dark. The figure ahead of me shivered, not in movement, but in its very existence, like it wasn't fully formed, or like it was becoming something else. Then it whispered, no words, just the shape of meaning pressing into my mind, curling through the gaps in my understanding. A sensation rather than a sentence. You remember me. I stopped walking. My breath felt heavier in my lungs, like the air had grown dense with something unseen. The figure didn't move closer, didn't shift again. It simply waited. Do I? The thought felt foreign, like it had been placed there rather than formed on its own. But as I stared at the figure, something familiar itched at the back of my mind, a knowing that shouldn't be there, a memory that wasn't mine but felt as if it had always been. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The silence between us stretched too long, bending into something that felt less like absence and more like presence. The ground beneath my feet darkened, shadows spreading out in tendrils, curling at the edges of my shoes. The sky, if it even was a sky, felt closer, heavier. The stars were wrong, unfamiliar, their constellations twisted into patterns I couldn't recognize. Then, another sound, not a whisper, a footstep behind me, not in the footprints that had already been placed, but a new one. A fresh one. I wasn't being followed anymore. I wasn't being mimicked. Something was stepping toward me now, deliberate, slow, without hesitation. The figure ahead of me tilted slightly, as if listening, as if waiting to see what I would do. I inhaled. The breath felt sharp, foreign in my own lungs. Another step behind me, closer. Whatever had been waiting was moving now. And I had the sinking feeling that it had always been moving. I had just been too lost in my own fear to notice. The figure ahead of me raised its head, just slightly. Choose. The meaning pressed into my mind with force this time, undeniable. Choose. The thing behind me took another step. The ground beneath me felt thinner, like if I moved the wrong way, I might fall through it entirely. The figure in front of me remained still. The presence behind me did not. My pulse pounded in my ears. The air felt thinner now, colder, suffocating, in a way that seemed to wrap around my throat. It wasn't just the oppressive weight of the atmosphere, but something deeper, something that tugged at the very core of my being. The figure ahead remained silent, watching as I stood frozen between the two forces. The ground beneath me seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't comprehend, an unsettling pulse, like the earth itself was alive and conscious of the decision I had yet to make. The sound of footsteps behind me, deliberate and slow, broke the silence again. The faintest scraping sound, as if something, or someone, was dragging their feet through the brittle, dry leaves scattered across the ground. There was no wind, yet I could hear the rustling, feel the tension in the air, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't turn, not yet. My instincts told me I didn't need to see it, that knowing it was there was enough. Choose, the figure whispered again, the word slipping into my mind like a foreign language, as though it had always been there, buried in the deepest corners of my thoughts. Its voice wasn't a sound, it was an intrusion, something that bypassed the ordinary senses and seeped directly into my consciousness. Something that knew me, knew everything about me, and yet it didn't. I tried to step forward, to move away from the presence that was slowly creeping up behind me. But my legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone, each movement slow and unnatural. The earth itself seemed to grasp at my ankles, as if holding me in place. The figure ahead didn't flinch. It didn't need to. It knew I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying my breath. The coldness wrapped tighter around my chest. It felt like I was sinking into something that wasn't entirely real, something made of shadows and forgotten thoughts. I could feel it, the pull of it, drawing me in deeper. The silence between the figure and me felt infinite now, a suffocating stretch of time that clung to my skin like a damp cloth. Then came a voice, faint at first, distant, as though it were calling to me from a place I couldn't quite reach. "You are already here." It was my voice, but not my voice. It was the voice of someone who had seen all that I had yet to see, someone who had already made the choice, someone who had already stepped into this place. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. The sound now had a rhythm, deliberate, as though whatever was walking toward me had its own timing, its own purpose. I could feel its presence, a weight at my back that was both familiar and foreign. I turned, almost without thinking, but my eyes never fully locked onto the shape. Not fully. The edges of it were unclear, as though it were cloaked in darkness, with only vague shapes suggesting what it was. A figure wrapped in shadows, faceless, but with an overwhelming sense of recognition. There was no clarity in its form, no definitive lines that I could hold onto, but I knew it. Somehow I knew it. My heart raced and a shiver ran down my spine. The figure that had been waiting for me. Had it always been here? Had it always been this close, just behind the veil of what I thought I knew? Was it what had brought me here? Or had I come on my own? The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only silence. The world around me seemed to still, as though holding its breath. I could feel the ground beneath me pulse again, the rhythm matching the beat of my own heart. Everything felt distorted, the edges of reality blurring like watercolors bleeding together, the sense of distance warped, the spaces between things becoming smaller, more suffocating. "Choose," the whisper repeated, a command this time, as though there was no choice but to obey. The air tasted metallic now, sharp in my mouth, and the coldness clung tighter to my skin. But the presence behind me remained, and I could feel the weight of it, the unseen eyes staring at me from the shadows, watching, waiting, expecting something. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know how to give it what it asked. "Choose," the voice repeated again, this time louder, louder than I thought it should have been. It echoed inside my head, bouncing off the walls of my thoughts, reverberating until the sound felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, from all directions, from all around me. The figure ahead of me didn't move. It stood still, waiting for me to act. But as I stood there, frozen in place, the air thick with the pressure of the decision I had to make, I realized something. This wasn't just a choice. It wasn't a question that could be answered. It was a trap designed to ensnare me in the very moment of indecision, to break me down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the waiting. And I wasn't sure if it was too late to turn back, or if I ever could. The wind began to stir again, but it felt wrong, like it wasn't part of the world I knew. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. It didn't flow like normal wind. It didn't even feel like wind at all. It was a weight, a physical presence that clung to the skin, as if the very atmosphere had become alive, breathing with a life that was not entirely natural. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shudder, as though it, too, was responding to some invisible force, some unspoken command. The figure ahead still stood unmoving, but now I could feel the air between us crackling with an energy I couldn't explain. It wasn't electricity, at least not in the sense I understood it. No, this felt more primal, ancient, a force that stretched beyond the reach of human comprehension. The edges of the figure blurred in my vision, as though it were not entirely solid. At times it seemed to melt into the surroundings, folding into the darkness, and at others it sharpened, becoming almost too real, too vivid. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My body screamed to move, to run, but I was frozen in place, my legs as heavy as if they were submerged in deep water. My breathing was shallow, each breath a battle, as though the very air had thickened to the point where inhaling was a struggle. Behind me, the footsteps had ceased. I hadn't heard them approach, but I could feel the presence there, something hovering just beyond the edge of my perception. It was as if the very space around me had warped, and whatever was standing, there was no longer bound by the same rules of reality I once knew. The figure before me, what was it? What was this place? I couldn't remember when it had stopped feeling like the world I knew. The streets, the buildings, none of them were familiar. The shadows stretched far too long for this time of day. There was no sun in the sky, no moon, just an eternal twilight that seemed to swallow all light, leaving only darkness. And yet I could still hear it, the whisper. It curled into my thoughts, tugging at the edges of my mind, pulling me deeper into its reach. "You're still here." The voice was low, deeper than before, and yet it felt like it came from inside me, rather than from the figure. I shuddered, my breath hitching in my chest. I had heard it before, but this time it felt different. More urgent, more familiar, as though it were speaking truths I wasn't ready to confront. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a feeling, a pressure that began at the base of my spine and radiated outward, filling every corner of my being. It was everywhere, all, encompassing, overwhelming. It's already too late. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to know, but a part of me had already understood. Deep down, I had known this moment would come. I could feel it like a bruise on my soul, the sensation that something, someone, was waiting for me to finally understand, to finally see the truth of it all. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't be ready. There was a quiet terror in knowing that I was on the edge of something I could not grasp, something that slipped just beyond my reach every time I thought I understood. It was like trying to hold water in my hands, only for it to slip through my fingers the moment I thought I had a grip on it. The figure before me tilted its head slightly, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I saw something else. A flash, an image, a memory of something long forgotten, a place, a time, a person. It flickered like a broken film reel, fragments of something that once mattered, once had been clear and sharp, now warped and hazy. But the more I tried to hold on to it, the faster it slipped away, leaving me with nothing but the echo of what I had almost seen. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't breathe. The world around me was distorting, stretching, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense, and yet it all felt so familiar, like I had been here before, like I had seen this before. "You can't leave now," the voice murmured, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, The air grew colder, more biting, and for a moment I thought I saw the figure move. But when I blinked, it was still there, watching me, unmoving. A jolt of panic shot through me, but before I could react, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't peace, it was resignation, acceptance, like the weight of the world had finally fallen away, leaving only this moment, only this choice. My heart began to race again, and yet I couldn't move, not a muscle. Not a single part of me was willing to break the stillness. I had come this far. Could I go further? Could I even stop this now? You are already part of it. The voice was louder now, not an echo, but an undeniable truth. I wasn't sure if it was speaking to me, or if it was speaking through me, but I felt it. Deep down, I felt it. And as I stood there, caught between what was and what could never be, the world around me seemed to breathe. A slow, heavy pulse that reverberated from the depths of the earth, from the core of this place. I knew then, I had been here before. In another life, in another time, perhaps, but I had been here. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I could feel it in every part of me. It was already too late to turn back. The air had grown thicker with each passing moment, suffocating, as though the very fabric of the world around me was compressing in on itself. The twisted streets stretched out before me like veins in a body, pulsing with an energy I could neither see nor fully comprehend. The buildings, once so distant and indifferent, now felt as if they were leaning in, pressing closer, whispering to each other in a language I couldn't understand, though I felt it in my bones. The shadows deepened around me, curling into corners and crevices, as though they were living things, shifting, waiting for something. I had never felt so small, so inconsequential. Every breath seemed to stretch longer, more labored. And yet the weight of the atmosphere did not ease. The world around me, this place, had become a labyrinth of half-formed shapes and muted colors, where nothing was quite real, and yet nothing felt false either. The soft hum of the unseen power behind it all was a constant presence in my mind, a distant thrumming that reverberated through every fiber of my being. The figure, still standing in the distance, had not moved. It was as if it were anchored there, a part of the land itself, part of something that was both foreign and deeply familiar. I couldn't look away, even though I knew I should. There was something hypnotic in its stillness, something that both repelled and drew me in. It was not a person, it wasn't even human, it was an idea, a concept, something ancient and unyielding. I tried to step forward, to move toward it, but my body felt sluggish, unwilling. Every step was like wading through water, thick and unrelenting. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift with each movement, as though it were not solid, but alive, responding to my every motion. I stopped, took a breath, and closed my eyes, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the overwhelming presence of the figure. But the voice came again, this time not a whisper, but a deep resonance that seemed to echo through the very air around me. It vibrated within me, filling every corner of my mind. You are not meant to be here. The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable dragging on like the tolling of a distant bell. I wanted to argue. I wanted to deny it, to fight against it. But something held me back. Some instinct, buried deep inside, whispered that the figure was right, that this place was not for me. But I had come this far. I had walked these strange streets, stumbled through the haze of confusion, and now there was no turning back. I forced my eyes open again, looking toward the figure, my heart pounding louder in my chest. But now, it wasn't as still as before. There was a subtle motion, a shift in its form, as though it were becoming more fluid, less defined. The edges of it seemed to waver, like heat rising from a pavement, distorting the air. It wasn't quite visible, not in any way that made sense. It was there, but it wasn't. It was a presence, an essence, something that transcended sight and sound. A deep chill ran down my spine as I took another step, this time with more intent. The world around me felt muffled, as though the air itself were thickening. muting everything but the pulsing beat of that distant hum. And then something changed. The ground beneath my feet cracked, the earth splitting with a sound like the tearing of fabric. The sky above, so dark and still, seemed to fracture, letting in a flash of blinding light that stung my eyes. I raised my arm instinctively to shield myself, but it didn't matter. The light wasn't real. It wasn't of this world. I took another step forward, despite the growing unease that gripped me. The light flickered again, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something in it. A face, a figure that mirrored mine, but not quite. It was twisted, contorted, staring back at me with eyes that weren't my own. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving me standing in the same desolate, dim, lit street. But I wasn't alone anymore. Behind me, a soft rustling sound, like the whisper of fabric brushing against itself, made me turn. My heart skipped a beat as I saw it. A figure, a woman. She was dressed in a flowing, dark gown, her hair long and tangled, her face obscured by the shadows. She moved like smoke, her presence barely there, as though she were both part of the world and not of it. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw an impossible depth, an eternity of experience and knowledge. Her lips barely moved as she spoke, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. You are already part of the cycle. I could feel her words sinking deep into me, wrapping around my consciousness, pulling me closer to something I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to step back, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the heavy pull of her presence. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering me, her gaze never wavering. The wind picked up, swirling around us, carrying with it the scent of rain, of earth, of something ancient and forgotten. You've always been here, she continued, her voice echoing in my mind now, louder than before. This place, this moment, it is all part of you. I swallowed, trying to speak, but my voice failed me. She stepped closer, her movement so fluid it was almost unreal, like she was gliding through the air rather than walking on the ground. You cannot leave until you remember. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break free from the invisible chains that bound me, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in the web of whatever this place was, whatever this thing was that had appeared before me. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, but it wasn't kind. There was something cold, something terrifying behind it, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of what I was facing. I wasn't just lost, I wasn't just confused. I was part of something far older, far darker than I had ever imagined. And there was no escape. The air was still, but the silence now felt heavy, almost suffocating. Every breath I took seemed to disturb the world around me, like I was breaking the fragile peace that had settled between the woman and myself. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight, as if the words were stuck inside me, unwilling to escape. My heart raced, thumping wildly in my chest as the weight of her gaze pressed down on me like a physical force. The woman, if that's what she even was, remained silent for a moment, her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, as if she were waiting for me to understand something. I wanted to look away, to break the connection, but I couldn't. It was as though her stare had taken hold of my very soul, holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot like a statue, unable to move. Her gaze felt ancient, as though she had witnessed everything that had ever happened in the world and yet had never truly been part of it. She stepped closer, her movement slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground as she moved. It was as if the earth beneath her didn't exist, and instead, she floated just above it, her gown trailing behind her like the mist from an early morning fog. Her presence seemed to stretch out, suffusing the very air around me, filling my lungs with something thick and dense, something that tasted of dust and forgotten memories. The wind, which had been soft and gentle, picked up again, whipping through the streets in a sudden gust. The leaves of the trees along the edges of the road rustled, their movement almost frantic, as if trying to escape something unseen. The shadows deepened, stretching longer, darker, until they seemed to curl at the edges of my vision, reaching toward me with fingers that were long and cold. The temperature dropped, the air turning frigid, and I could see my breath in front of me now, a mist of condensation forming with every exhale. The woman's lips parted slightly, her eyes narrowing, and in the stillness of that moment, her voice drifted toward me like a whisper carried on the wind. "You've been here before." The words were soft but final, echoing in my mind like the toll of a distant bell. The weight of them pressed into my chest, making it harder to breathe, as though the air itself had thickened around me. I tried to shake my head, to deny it, but the truth was creeping into the edges of my consciousness, insidious and undeniable. I had been here before. I remembered flashes, fragments of a life that seemed to slip just beyond my grasp. Faces I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Places that felt both strange and familiar. Moments that had never truly happened, but lingered in my mind like a dream I couldn't quite shake off. It was all just out of reach, like trying to catch the scent of a flower that had already bloomed and died, the memory of it fading before I could hold it. The woman's smile grew, but it wasn't comforting. It was cold, like the grin of someone who knew far too much, someone who had seen things they should never have seen. She stepped closer still, her presence overwhelming now, filling every inch of space around me. I could feel her breath, icy and faint, brushing against my skin. "Do you remember now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. I didn't know how to answer. The question felt like a trap, one I could never escape. How could I remember something I wasn't sure I'd ever experienced? And yet, as her words sank into me, I knew there was something deep within me that had been forgotten. Something that tied me to this place, to this moment, to her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek with a feather-light touch. The coldness of her skin seeped through me, sending a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I felt as though I were no longer standing in the street, no longer even in my own body. I was adrift, floating in a space that was neither here nor there, caught between time and memory, caught between life and death. And then, like a flicker of a candle's flame in the dark, I saw it. A flash of recognition, a moment sharp and fleeting, like the briefest glimpse of a dream on the edge of waking. I had been here before. I had stood on this very street, in this very place, and I had seen her. I had heard those same words. I had known what was going to happen. "You don't belong here." Her words cut through the air like a blade. "But you will stay. You will always stay." A deep sense of dread bloomed inside me, curling in my stomach like a knot that I couldn't undo. I felt like I was falling, plummeting into a void, into a place where there was no escape. The wind picked up again, the howling of it now deafening in my ears. The shadows around me seemed to dance, pulling at the corners of my vision, twisting into shapes that weren't quite human. The streetlights flickered, their light dimming and brightening in rhythm with my heartbeat. The world around me felt like it was collapsing, and yet I couldn't move. "You're already a part of it," the woman said, her voice now sharp, cold. "There is no leaving. You are here now. And this place will always be your home." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, caught in the web of her words, in the web of this place that had never truly existed, and yet had always been there. The shadows closed in around me, pressing against my skin, as the woman's cold, knowing gaze never left me. I could feel myself fading, slipping further into the dark, as the world around me twisted and contorted. And in the distance, a faint sound began to rise distant, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder, more distinct. A clock ticking relentlessly toward its final chime. The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, steady and rhythmic, as though it were counting down to something inevitable. The echoes of its chimes reverberated through the air, vibrating the ground beneath me, and I felt it in my bones, in the very marrow of my body. Every tick was like a pulse, a reminder that time was moving forward, dragging me along with it, whether I wanted to go or not. I turned my head, but the woman was gone. One moment she was standing before me, her gaze piercing into my soul, and the next, she had melted into the shadows. I blinked, searching the street, trying to find any trace of her, but there was nothing. The once muted streetlights now hummed with a harsh light, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. The air, thick with the oppressive sense of dread, felt heavier now, almost suffocating. The wind had stopped. The eerie quiet seemed to press against me, its presence just as unsettling as the howling gusts that had preceded it. The world around me felt wrong, like I had stumbled into a parallel existence where nothing was quite as it should be. The buildings, once familiar, now loomed over me, towering and unfamiliar. Their windows were dark, lifeless, as though no one had inhabited them in years. Yet I could sense something barely perceptible, shifting within the shadows behind those windows. Eyes, faces, I couldn't be sure. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stepped forward, my feet crunching on the gravel beneath me. The sound seemed too loud in the silence, a stark contrast to the dead calm that surrounded me. I had no idea where I was going, no idea how I'd even ended up here, but something told me that I had been here before, not just physically, but somewhere deeper, somewhere more primal. The feeling clawed at my chest, pulling at my ribs, until I could almost taste it. The sense that I had crossed some kind of threshold, and there was no going back. I was here, I was a part of this. I quickened my pace, moving faster down the street, the ticking of the clock still echoing in my ears, though I had no idea where it was coming from. The buildings seemed to close in around me, their sharp angles and jagged edges like teeth, and I began to wonder, was I still in the same place I had been before? Or had the world shifted again, warped into something unrecognizable? The streetlights flickered, their light flickering in time with my heartbeat, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. I swore I saw something out of the corner of my eye, shapes darting between the darkened windows, figures with no faces, their movements unnervingly fast. I turned my head, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just the empty, lifeless streets, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly aware of the stillness. No birds, no sounds of cars, no hum of distant life. Just the oppressive weight of silence pressing in from all sides. The world seemed suspended, like it was waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to make a move. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt a coldness creeping over my skin. The air had grown thick, damp, and the scent of something earthy and decayed hung heavy in the atmosphere. It was the smell of rot, of forgotten things, of a place long left abandoned. And yet, I could feel the pulse of life underneath it all. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Something was living here. Something was waiting. I felt my breath hitch in my throat as the shadows around me seemed to stretch further, crawling toward me like dark tendrils, curling and twisting with slow, deliberate movements. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. It was as though I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than my own fear. Then I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft at first, like the shuffle of someone walking with no particular purpose, but then they grew louder, closer, the rhythmic sound of someone or something moving toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, my eyes scanning the street behind me. There was no one there, but the footsteps persisted, each step growing louder, faster. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. My throat tightened, as if something was choking me from the inside. The sound of the footsteps filled the silence, growing deafening now, and I realized with a jolt that I was no longer standing still. My feet were moving, carrying me forward, though I had no control over them. I was walking towards something that I couldn't see, but could feel with every fiber of my being. It was as if the very ground beneath me was shifting, pulling me along as if I were a puppet on a string, and the footsteps grew louder with every step I took. I was close now, so close, and then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, the footsteps stopped. I froze, everything around me stilled. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath, and I waited for something, anything, to break the silence. The clock was still ticking, its endless rhythm now sounding louder than ever in my mind. And then, from the darkness, a voice broke the silence. Low and guttural, but unmistakably clear. "You're already too late." The voice echoed in the stillness, reverberating deep into my bones, and for a moment, everything around me seemed to disappear. The world, the street, the buildings, they all faded into the background, like they were nothing more than a distant memory, and in their place stood only the oppressive weight of that voice. It wasn't human, it wasn't real. "You're already too late." The words repeated in my mind, looping, mocking me, as if they were embedded in the very fabric of my thoughts. I felt a chill travel up my spine, spreading like a slow burn from the core of my body, until my skin was prickling with the sensation of something crawling beneath it. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs were frozen, my feet rooted to the spot, unwilling or perhaps unable to obey the frantic commands of my mind. Forcing myself to breathe, I focused on the ground beneath me, the cold, damp pavement beneath my shoes, the crackling of pebbles as they shifted underfoot. The world felt more alive now. The silence was no longer empty but laden with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. A deep unease washed over me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. What had I stumbled into? I could feel the shadows pressing against me, thick and suffocating, as though they were drawing closer, inching forward with each passing second. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath fogging in the air, each exhale like a small cloud escaping my lips, only to dissipate into the frigid atmosphere. The street lights flickered again, casting uneven pools of light that seemed to warp and shift with each passing blink. But it wasn't the light that held my attention now, it was the darkness, and in the depths of it, I could almost make out something moving. Not with my eyes, but with my senses. It was as if the shadows themselves had become alive, reaching out toward me like hungry tendrils. I turned my head sharply, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, every instinct screaming at me to look away. But the air around me felt thick, almost oppressive, as though something invisible was pressing down on me. The familiar streets were gone, swallowed by the blackness that had overtaken them. The world I thought I knew was vanishing piece by piece, replaced by something foreign, something ancient. And then I heard it again, a voice this time louder, more insistent. "You've been here before." The words slipped into my mind like a slow poison, twisting everything I thought I knew. The street, the buildings, the people, had I really seen them for what they were? Or had I been walking in circles, trapped in this twisted version of reality? A terrible realization clawed at my chest, as if something inside me was waking up. I had been here before. I had walked this same road, breathed this same air, felt this same growing dread. It was all too familiar, but at the same time it wasn't. It was like a dream, a recurring nightmare that I couldn't escape from, no matter how hard I tried. And the voice continued, "You will die here." I froze. The words felt cold against my skin, like fingers dragging along the surface of my body, leaving a trail of ice in their wake. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I felt like I might lose control. The air seemed to thicken, and the very ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like it might crack open at any moment. I wanted to scream, to fight against this suffocating darkness, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of the fear that had locked me in place. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were forming, taking shape, moving with purpose, and the unmistakable outlines of figures began to emerge. Tall and looming, their faces hidden in darkness, but their presence undeniable. There were more than one, and they moved toward me with an eerie, slow precision. I could feel the hairs on my arms rising as I instinctively backed away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped in the middle of the street, alone with these things, whatever they were. Their silhouettes stretched across the street, their movements so deliberate that they seemed to be walking in perfect rhythm with my own pulse. The figures were getting closer now, so close that I could almost make out details. Their forms were shifting, constantly warping, like fluid shadows that refused to stay in one shape. They seemed to be made of the darkness itself, stretching and pulling with each step. My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of them. If I could, I would have turned and fled. But I couldn't. As the figures surrounded me, I felt a cold, suffocating grip tighten around my chest. I gasped, my breath quick and shallow, the coldness from before now wrapping around me like chains. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything except the voice that spoke once again, its tone low and terrifyingly calm. You won't remember how you got here, you'll forget everything, but it will always find you. It will always bring you back. And with those final words, the shadows closed in, swallowing me whole. The world seemed to tilt as I struggled to breathe, my chest tight, as if an invisible weight pressed down on me. The shadows enveloped me, their cold, clammy hands wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I tried to scream, but the sound was smothered, lost in the suffocating void that surrounded me. I could feel my pulse racing, thumping erratically against my ribs, but it was as if the very air was trying to strangle it out of me, forcing me to stay silent, to stay still. The figures, those terrible, looming shapes, drew closer, their form now clearer than before, their movements deliberate and slow, almost predatory. Their faces, hidden within the cloak of shadow, seemed to shift and ripple like water, flickering between moments of grotesque clarity and maddening distortion. There was something wrong with their faces, something that I couldn't quite understand. It was as if their expressions were both frozen and yet in constant flux, caught in an eternal struggle between being human and something much older, much darker. I felt the cold tightening around my throat, suffocating me, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if this was it, if this was the moment I would die. The voice had told me that I would die here, that I had been here before. But was this the end? Was there any escape? Or had I already been consumed by the darkness, trapped in this never-ending nightmare? Suddenly, the grip around my chest loosened, and I gasped, air flooding my lungs in shallow, desperate breaths. I staggered backward, struggling to regain some sense of control over my own body. The figures stood still now, observing me with unnerving patience, as if waiting for something, watching me as I stumbled against the oppressive weight of the shadows. My legs shook beneath me, but I refused to fall. I refused to give in to the fear, no matter how close it came to swallowing me whole. I turned my head, scanning my surroundings, trying to find something, anything that would tell me where I was, how to escape. But there was nothing. The street that had once been so familiar, the buildings that lined the edges of the road, had all disappeared. The world around me was an endless void, nothing but swirling darkness stretching infinitely in every direction. And then something shifted. The shadows quivered, as if reacting to something unseen, and the ground beneath me trembled. A low, rumbling sound vibrated through the air, like the distant growl of a storm. But this was no ordinary storm. It was something much worse, something that carried with it the weight of inevitability. The very fabric of the reality I had known was unraveling, and with it, everything that had once seemed solid, familiar, began to disintegrate. The figures, still standing motionless, seemed to be waiting for the storm to reach its crescendo, to reach its apex. And as the rumbling grew louder, as the air grew thicker, I realized something else. I was not alone. In the distance, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the void, her form outlined by the faintest flicker of light. I couldn't see her face, but something about the way she stood, alone, as if waiting, called to me. There was something strangely familiar about her, a sense of recognition that clawed at the edges of my mind. It was as if I had seen her before, or perhaps she had seen me, but the memory was vague, a whisper on the edge of my consciousness. I wanted to call out to her, to ask who she was, to beg for answers, but the words stuck in my throat, lodged there by a force I couldn't explain. All I could do was watch as she slowly began to move, her steps fluid and purposeful, as though she were walking through the very fabric of the void itself. The figures around me remained still, but I could feel their attention shift toward her, the weight of their focus drawing the air tighter around me. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt a rising dread as the woman continued her slow approach. I couldn't understand why, but I was terrified. Terrified of her, terrified of the figures, and terrified of what they all might do to me. But then, as if responding to my thoughts, the woman's figure blurred, distorting in a way that made my stomach lurch. Her form began to melt, like wax dripping in slow motion, stretching and twisting until it was nothing more than a shapeless mass in the distance. I blinked, and in that instant she was gone, completely vanished. The void around me seemed to exhale, as if it had released some terrible pressure, but there was no relief. Only the growing certainty that whatever I had just witnessed was more than a dream. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The rumbling ceased, the weight of the shadows lifted, and for a brief moment I could hear the faint rustling of real wind, like the kind that filled the air during a storm. The streetlights flickered again, casting their uneven light across the empty road. The figures were gone. The darkness had receded. I stood in the middle of the street, disoriented and unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was I awake? Or was I still trapped in whatever twisted version of reality I had stumbled into? I glanced around, my eyes wide and searching, but there was nothing left. No sign of the shadows, no sign of the figures, and no sign of the woman who had vanished. The world seemed oddly still now, as if time itself had paused, but the feeling of being watched never left. The unnerving thought gnawed at me. Was I being tested? Had this been some sort of trial? And what if there was no escape? The street was still, eerily so, like the calm after a storm that never really came. The lights hummed overhead, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance in the periphery of my vision, teasing me. My mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The woman, the figures, the void. It was as if the world itself had stretched thin, like fabric pulled too tight, and now, in its place, only this unnatural silence lingered. I took a step forward, the soles of my shoes tapping softly against the damp pavement. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling up like fingers reaching for the light. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it were filled with some invisible weight. The sounds of the city, those distant whispers of life that had once surrounded me, seemed miles away now, as though they were locked behind an impenetrable wall. My breath caught in my chest, a knot tightening in my stomach. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was a growing unease, a constant itch at the back of my mind. It was too quiet, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It had been with me since the woman's disappearance, that creeping sensation that I was no longer alone. But no one was in sight, no strange figures lurking in the shadows. Yet I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with each turn. Then, as I reached the next street corner, something shifted in the distance. A figure stood at the far end of the road. A tall, imposing shape. I froze, staring, trying to make sense of it. For a moment, I thought it might be another of those shadowy beings, but this one felt different. It was too solid, too human in its presence. There was no flickering distortion, no illusionary quality to its form. It stood there, unmoving, watching me with a strange intensity. Its silhouette was hard to make out at first, blurred by the dim streetlight, but as I took a step closer, the details became clearer. A man, he was dressed in a long coat, the collar turned up against the cold night air. His face was obscured by the shadow of his wide, brimmed hat, but even from this distance, I could sense the gaze of his eyes. I couldn't explain it, just the deep, unsettling feeling that his presence carried. His stillness was unnatural, like a statue carved into place, frozen in time. But there was something about the way he stood, this odd, unnatural poise, that made me hesitate. As if sensing my trepidation, the man shifted, the subtle movement almost imperceptible. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, his pace slow and deliberate, each footfall resonating in the silence like a deep thud. My heart raced. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else that kept me rooted to the spot. I wanted to turn and run, to escape the unnerving calm that hung in the air, but I couldn't. And then he spoke. His voice was low, steady, calm, but somehow chilling. It was like the sound of dry leaves scraping against a window pane, thin and brittle. "You've been expecting me." I blinked, the words cutting through the fog in my mind. It took me a moment to gather my thoughts, to find my voice, but when I did, it came out in a whisper. I don't know who you are." The man took another step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and probing, as if he were peeling back the layers of my mind, searching for something buried deep inside. A sense of dread crept up my spine, colder than the mist that swirled around us. "You know who I am," he said, his voice unwavering, almost knowing. "I'm the one who knows what you will become, what you will do, what you will leave behind." A chill ran through me. I stepped back, shaking my head. "I don't. What are you talking about? What do you want?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, its leather cover creased with age. He flipped it open, and my breath caught as his finger ran down the pages. Each turn seemed deliberate, methodical. Finally, he stopped. "There you are," he murmured, his voice soft but filled with a terrifying certainty. He looked up at me, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know your future." The words hit me like a physical blow, and my mind spun. I wanted to ask him what he meant, how he knew, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could barely focus on anything other than the dread building in my chest. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "You've known this day would come, haven't you, since the moment you met me?" I could feel my heart pounding, a drumbeat in my ears. "What are you talking about?" I asked again, but this time the words were less certain. A flicker of recognition danced at the edges of my thoughts, but it slipped away before I could grasp it. The man smiled again, and this time there was something sinister in it. His teeth were unnaturally white against the shadow of his face, sharp and predatory. He closed the notebook with a soft snap and tucked it back into his coat. "You're not the first," he said, his voice now barely above a whisper, "and you won't be the last." Before I could respond, he turned, his long coat trailing behind him as he walked away, his figure slowly swallowed by the mist. The silence returned, heavier than ever, and I was left standing alone in the middle of the street, the memory of his words lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. What had just happened? Who was he? More importantly, why had I felt that sense of recognition? I stood frozen, trying to piece together the fragments of the encounter. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that I couldn't remember when the last time I had seen him was, or if I had seen him at all before tonight. And then, just as I was about to take a step forward, I heard it, a faint whisper in the wind, "Don't forget your future." The air had grown colder, an unsettling chill creeping through the streets, thickening the mist that now clung to every building, every lamppost, every surface it could find. The street, once filled with the ordinary hum of life, now felt like an empty stage set for something unseen, something ominous. The soft, echoing thud of my footsteps on the wet pavement seemed to stretch endlessly into the silence that had settled over the city. The encounter with the man, the one who seemed to know more about me than I did, lingered in my mind, clawing at my thoughts. His cryptic words, his chilling smile, and that unnerving notebook, they all twisted together in my head, refusing to let go. I had to know more. I had to understand what he meant when he said I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. But as the minutes passed, I realized that even if I wanted to find him again, I wouldn't know where to start. The city had changed in ways I couldn't quite explain, and there was something in the air, something in the weight of the atmosphere, that told me the answers I sought weren't going to be found easily. As I walked deeper into the fog, I felt a strange pull, a subtle shift that tugged at me. The streetlights ahead blurred, their halos of yellow light swirling like liquid in the mist. The buildings, which had once looked familiar, now seemed distant, alien, as though I were walking through a dream rather than a city I had known for years. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being guided, drawn somewhere by something unseen. A low murmur rose in my ears, distant yet persistent. I stopped for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The sounds of the city were gone, replaced by this faint whisper, a voice just below the threshold of comprehension. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it, like a memory I couldn't place, a face I couldn't quite remember. I strained to listen, to pick out the words, but they remained just out of reach, slipping away as quickly as they came. And then, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted, the street before me changed. The familiar rows of buildings melted away, replaced by something that felt ancient, crumbling, yet still impossibly real. A brick wall lined with ivy, weathered wooden doors, and a single lamppost, casting an eerie, flickering light over a narrow alleyway that seemed to stretch on forever. The pavement beneath my feet turned rough, uneven, the cobblestones slick with dampness. The sense of being somewhere new, somewhere unknown, enveloped me completely. This wasn't the city I had known. This wasn't even the street I had been walking down moments ago. A new wave of fear gripped my chest as I stood there, trying to understand how I had gotten here. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the pulse of anxiety begin to race through my veins. Where was I? How had everything changed so suddenly? And most troubling of all, why did I feel like I had been here before? Before I could move, a shadow passed in front of the alleyway, crossing the flickering light from the lamppost. The figure was tall, draped in a long coat, its features obscured by the darkness of the alley. The same coat, the same silhouette. My heart skipped a beat, and my body froze. The man. He stepped forward into the dim light, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But I could see it now, the way he moved, fluid, almost unnatural, like a predator gliding through the night. His presence was overpowering, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. Despite the terror clawing at my insides, I stepped forward, compelled by something I couldn't explain. Something deep inside told me that I had to confront him, that there was no escape from whatever fate had already been set in motion. As I approached, the man stopped and turned, slowly, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes glinted beneath the brim of his hat, the only part of his face visible in the shadows. There was something unsettlingly familiar about them, something that made my heart tighten in my chest. It was the same gaze, the same cold, knowing look he had given me before. But this time, there was something else there. Something new, something dangerous. "You came," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, constricted, as though I had forgotten how to use my own voice. My mind raced, questions tumbling over one another. Why was I here? What did he want? What had he meant by those cryptic words? But no answers came. Instead, the man took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You wanted to know more," he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "You wanted to understand what was happening to you, what this all means. I nodded, unable to speak, my mind too tangled in confusion and fear to form coherent thoughts. His lips curled into a faint smile, one that sent a chill straight through me. "I can show you," he said, his voice low and soft, as though the words were a secret meant only for me. "But know this, once you see it, there is no turning back. There are no second chances, no resets." I shuddered at his words, my skin prickling as the weight of his gaze bore down on me. "What do you mean?" I managed to croak, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man stepped forward again, closer now, until I could feel the faintest pressure of his presence against me. "I can show you your future," he said softly, "but you have to be ready to accept it." For a moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the answer. The thought of seeing what lay ahead, seeing how it would all end. Was I ready for that? Was I ready to face whatever he knew? I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, but no words came. Instead, I was left with a hollow sense of inevitability, as though I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't escape, something I had no control over. The man reached into his coat and pulled out that same notebook again, the one that had once seemed so insignificant, so distant. His fingers flipped through the pages, stopping at one, and he held it out to me. I took it in my hands, the paper thin and fragile, like it might crumble away at any moment. "This is where you belong," he said. "This is your fate." I stared down at the page. The words, written in an elegant hand, were clear and unmistakable. And as my eyes traced the lines of text, I felt a cold, heavy truth settle over me. The words on the page, they were mine. The fog had deepened, swallowing the world in a thick, suffocating haze. Every step I took felt like I was walking through a dream, each footfall absorbed by the mist that clung to the cobblestones, damp and cold. I could barely make out the faint outlines of buildings that seemed to rise out of the nothingness, like ghostly structures from a forgotten world. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting dim halos of yellow light that barely cut through the growing darkness. The silence was heavy, oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like something is watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't escape the man's words, the weight of the notebook in my hands, the promise that he had shown me my future. Every part of me wanted to run, to throw the book away and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A part of me, the part that had been searching for answers, couldn't let go of what he had said. "This is your fate." The man had told me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been right. The page in the notebook had been clear, almost too clear. There was no mistaking the words that were written there, and the way they described my future. It felt like they had been etched into my very soul. My name had been written there, in ink that seemed almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm of its own, and beneath it the words, "My death, my end." A final moment that, according to the book, would come sooner than I wanted to believe. The words weren't just a prediction. They felt like a promise. I could still see the man's face in my mind, that cold, knowing expression as he had handed me the notebook. The same strange, unreadable smile that had made my skin crawl. He hadn't told me how or when it would happen. He had simply given me the words, a glimpse into something I had no control over. And now, standing alone in this fog-choked street, I was left with the unbearable weight of it. I couldn't let go. It felt like the book was pulling me into something far deeper than I was ready for. I had to know more. But as I stood there, caught between fear and curiosity, I felt the world shift again. The mist grew thicker, more oppressive, as though the very air was thickening with something ancient, something older than time itself. A distant sound, faint at first, began to rise from the depths of the fog. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind, too soft to make out. Then, as I strained to listen, the sound began to grow louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. The faint echo of footsteps, slow and deliberate, advancing toward me from somewhere deep within the haze. I turned instinctively, to look behind me, but the street was empty, shrouded in an endless curtain of mist. The fog had swallowed everything, leaving me in isolation, unsure of where I was or who or what was coming for me. I held the notebook tightly, as if its fragile pages could somehow protect me from whatever was approaching. The footsteps grew louder still, until I could almost feel the vibrations in the ground beneath me. There was something deliberate in the rhythm of the steps, something predatory. My heart began to race, pounding against my ribs, as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wanted to run, to escape the sound, but my body refused to move. It was as if the fog itself was holding me in place, tightening its grip around me, making escape impossible. Then, out of the fog, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shadow moving through the mist, like a wisp of smoke, shifting and formless. But as it drew closer, I could make out the outline of a man. His features were blurred, his face obscured by the thickening fog, but his presence was undeniable. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, as though he was gliding, his feet barely touching the ground. His coat billowed behind him, floating in the air as if it had no weight at all. I could hear the unmistakable sound of breath, heavy, deliberate, like the exhale of someone who had been waiting for this moment. And then he spoke, "You know why I'm here." His voice was calm, too calm, as though he had been expecting me all along. The words sank deep into my bones, chilling me in a way that nothing else had. There was no denying it. This man knew me in a way no one else could. His voice carried a weight of certainty that made me question my own existence. I tried to speak, to ask him who he was or what he wanted, but my throat was tight, constricted by the fear that had settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Instead, I just stared at him, my heart thudding in my chest, unable to break free from the strange pull that seemed to hold me here. He took another step forward, and this time I could see his face more clearly, though still shrouded in shadow. His eyes dark, endless, like black holes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt like I was falling into them, sinking deeper into something I couldn't understand. The man smiled, that same unnerving smile that I had seen before. It was wide, almost mocking, as if he knew something I didn't, something that I would soon understand. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper now. "The future." I nodded, a chill running down my spine as the words left his mouth. How could he know? How could he possibly understand what had happened, what I had read? I felt a surge of panic rise within me, but at the same time, something about his presence felt familiar. Like I had known him all my life, like he had been a part of my story from the very beginning. The future, the man continued, isn't what you think it is. It's a path, one that loops, one that twists in ways you can't possibly anticipate. You may think you know how it will end, but you're only seeing one thread in a much larger tapestry. He took another step closer, and I instinctively took a step back, the fog thickening around us as though the world itself was closing in. "You can't escape it," he said softly, "but you can change it. The question is, will you?" I didn't know how to respond. The fear that had been gnawing at me, the terror that had been building inside of me for what felt like an eternity, suddenly morphed into something else, something almost like understanding. Could I change my future? Could I stop the death that was supposedly waiting for me? But before I could ask him anything more, the man stepped back, his form fading into the fog, his presence dissipating like a wisp of smoke. His final words lingered in the air, almost too quiet to hear, as if the wind itself was carrying them away. "You'll see it soon enough." The fog closed in around me, and I was left standing alone, my mind spinning, unable to shake the man's words. The notebook in my hands felt heavier than ever, as though it too had become a part of the world that now seemed so unfamiliar. And for the first time, I realized he hadn't just shown me my future. He had shown me the door to something much darker, something that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. It was waiting for me, It had always been waiting. The fog had thickened into a near impenetrable wall, the very air now saturated with an eerie silence that seemed to hang like a weight on my chest. I couldn't hear a thing. No breeze, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum of city life. It was as if the world had ceased to exist beyond the reach of this strange mist. My breath came out in shallow bursts, the chill in the air making it hard to draw in enough. With every step I took, the ground beneath my shoes seemed to become softer, more uneven, as though the very earth was giving way to something deeper, something hidden beneath. I clutched the notebook tightly to my chest, the weight of it more oppressive now than it had ever been. The pages, once filled with knowledge and foreboding, now felt like the only tether to whatever this was, whatever was pulling me deeper into the unknown. I had read the words more times than I cared to admit, each reading making the future feel more like a sentence than a path. It was as if the words had burned themselves into my mind, leaving no room for doubt or escape. The man's words still echoed in my mind, their meaning twisting, shifting with every passing moment. The future is a path, one that loops, one that twists. I couldn't shake the thought that what I had seen wasn't just a glimpse of the end. It was a cycle, a pattern that repeated itself. But where did it lead? Where did I fit in all of this? As I moved through the fog, I couldn't help but notice the strange sense of déjà vu that clung to me. Every step felt familiar, as if I had walked this path before, and yet I couldn't remember where it led, or what waited for me at the end of it. I stopped, standing still in the middle of the mist-laden street, listening. There it was again, footsteps, soft and deliberate. Slow, almost measured. I turned my head, but the world around me was still a blur of shifting shadows and wisps of white. No one was there, nothing but the heavy blanket of fog wrapping everything in a soft, muted haze. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct now, and they were coming closer, approaching with a steady rhythm that seemed to resonate in my chest. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place as if I were rooted to the ground. My breath caught in my throat, the pressure in my chest rising with each step that drew nearer. Then, the figure emerged from the fog. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette against the mist, barely distinguishable from the swirling mass around it. But as it came closer, the outline became clearer, more defined, and I could see the man standing before me once again. His presence was unmistakable, his features still obscured by the heavy mist, but there was no mistaking him, no doubting that he was the same figure who had haunted my thoughts, my nightmares, for what seemed like forever. He smiled at me, that same unsettling smile that sent a shiver through my spine, as if he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to understand. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. His words sent a tremor through me, a chill that ran from the top of my head to the tips of my fingers. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him what this was all about, what he wanted from me, but the words stuck in my throat. He was right, he knew. I could feel it in the air between us, the tension that had been building since the first moment he had spoken to me. It was as if he had been waiting for me, as if he had known all along that I would find him again. "What is this?" I managed to force out, my voice barely more than a rasp. "Why are you here?" He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he were savoring the moment, enjoying the fear that radiated from me. His eyes dark and empty, as black as the void itself, bore into me with a knowing intensity, like they could see into my soul. "You've read the book," he said, his voice now low, almost reverent. "You've seen the future, but the future, it's not what you think, not entirely." His words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to process what he was saying. How could he know about the book? How could he know about what I had read? I hadn't even told anyone, hadn't shared it with a single soul. And yet, here he was, as if he had been walking this path alongside me the entire time. "You're part of it now. He continued, his voice growing softer, almost intimate. The future isn't just something that happens to you. It's something that you shape, something you bend and twist. But every action, every choice, it all leads back to this moment, to me. I took a step back, my mind racing, but he didn't move. His presence filled the space around me, like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. It was suffocating, the air too thick to breathe. You can't run from it, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. You've seen your death, haven't you? You think you know how it ends, but it's more than just the end. It's the beginning of something else. I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words, but they twisted and shifted in my mind, slipping through my fingers like smoke. He was toying with me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, unraveling something deep inside. I don't understand. I whispered, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze lingering on me with a strange mixture of pity and something darker, something more sinister. And then, with a sudden movement, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, cold and lifeless. I want you to choose, he said simply. I want you to choose what comes next. And just like that, he was gone, his presence fading into the mist as though he had never been there at all. The fog closed in around me, thick and suffocating, leaving me alone in the silence once again. The words he had left me with echoed in my mind. Choose what comes next. What choice was there? Was there even a choice at all? Had I already made my decision without realizing it? My mind raced, trying to grasp at something solid in the swirling fog, but all I had were his words, and the knowledge that something had changed. The fog was thick, so dense that I couldn't see beyond a few feet in front of me. It curled around my legs like a living thing, moving with a mind of its own, whispering in soft, muffled tones that I couldn't quite decipher. I stood still, my mind whirling with everything that had happened, with the cryptic words that had been left hanging in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating me. Choose what comes next. Those words echoed in my head over and over until they felt like a mantra, a command I couldn't escape, a choice I couldn't ignore. But what choice? What had I really been given? Was it a choice at all? Or was this all part of the pattern I had been blindly walking through without even realizing it? I reached for the notebook, my fingers trembling as they traced the familiar, weathered edges. The pages felt colder now, heavier, as if they carried the weight of something far more sinister than just the words written upon them. The ink had darkened, smudging slightly in places, as if time itself had bled into the pages. The more I read, the more it seemed as though the answers were right there, within reach, and yet they were so far out of my grasp. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the streets, swirling the fog into shapes that seemed to shift and twist like figures out of a nightmare. I looked up, instinctively searching for something, anything that might provide clarity, but the street remained empty. The buildings, the lampposts, the windows, they were all covered in a haze, indistinguishable from the fog. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then, just as I was about to take a step forward, I heard it. The faintest sound, like a soft murmur, something I couldn't quite place. It was almost a hum, a vibration in the air, something that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. My eyes darted around, trying to find the source, but all I saw was the swirling fog, the shadowed outlines of buildings that seemed as trapped in this world as I was. And then, through the mist, I saw him, the man, the one who had been haunting my every thought, every dream. He was standing there, just beyond the veil of fog, watching me with that same unsettling smile on his face. His eyes dark, empty, and knowing bore into mine with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "You're still here," he said softly, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves, hollow and distant. I took a step back, my mind reeling. Why was he still here? Hadn't I left him behind? Was this the choice he had meant? To meet him again, to face whatever this was. You knew I'd come back, didn't you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but it felt as though the very words were weighed down with meaning. He nodded slowly, the smile never leaving his face. Yes, I always knew. The fog seemed to tighten around us, the air thick with the sense of inevitability. There was no escaping it. The words he had spoken, the cryptic message, the visions, I could feel them all closing in on me now, like the slow, inevitable collapse of a dream. The weight of it all pressed down on my chest, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I would collapse beneath it. What happens now? I asked, the question more for myself than for him. A desperate attempt to understand whatever this was, whatever I had become entangled in. The man took a step forward, the fog parting just enough for me to see him more clearly. His face, though familiar, seemed off. There was a pallor to his skin, a coldness in his expression that hadn't been there before, as if he were a reflection of something I couldn't fully understand. "You've already chosen," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "It was never about what you wanted. It's about what's already been decided." I shook my head, confusion and fear mingling in my chest like a storm. "What do you mean, what's already been decided?" He stepped even closer, now just inches away, and for a moment I thought I could see something flicker in his eyes. A brief flash of something darker, something older. "Everything," he said softly, "your past, your future, your death. It was always part of the plan. A plan you couldn't see because you were too caught up in the illusion of choice." A deep, gut-wrenching realization hit me like a wave. I had never truly been in control. My choices, my decisions, they had always been predetermined, shaped by forces I couldn't see, couldn't understand. The book, the man, the visions, it was all part of a cycle, one that I couldn't break, no matter how hard I tried. And in that moment, I realized that there was no escaping it, no escaping him, no escaping the inevitable. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. I was no longer sure if I wanted to know the answer, but the question had to be asked. The man's smile widened ever so slightly, and his eyes glinted with something dark and ancient. "I want you to see, I want you to understand that there was never a way out. There was never a choice. It was always this. It's always been this." I felt a chill seep into my bones as the fog seemed to close in around me once more. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of my helplessness, my inability to escape this twisted fate. And then, without another word, the man turned and began to walk away, his figure dissolving into the fog as though he were nothing more than a part of it. The mist swallowed him whole, leaving me standing alone in the cold, with nothing but the weight of his words and the creeping realization that I was never going to be free. The last thing I heard before the world around me went silent was his voice, distant but clear, echoing in my mind. "Your death has already been written. The future is set." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to breathe, knowing in that moment that the cycle would never end. Not for me, not for anyone. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog parted, revealing the world beyond. But everything was different now. It was as if the fabric of reality had shifted, and I was no longer part of it. The future had been written, and I was just another page in its endless, unchanging story.